Norm, thank you so much for joining me today. Means a lot.
My pleasure.
Yesterday, the Lancet released a new report. They estimate the death toll in the Gaza Strip from October 7th, 2023 until June 30th, 2024. And the authors begin by addressing the fact that the Gaza Ministry of Health has routinely been questioned by pro-Israel politicians and pundits who charge that the quote Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry produces fraudulent data. In a 2014 lecture, you predicted that Israel had banned human rights monitors from Gaza after Operation Cast Lead, so that the only reliable source of health and casualty data during Israel's assaults would be the Gaza Health Ministry, who Israel would then accuse of being Hamas and making up all of its data, which is exactly what Israel and its supporters have done. But this report that was released yesterday did say that the Gaza Health Ministry figures are inaccurate, though not in the way that Israel supporters contend. The Lancet found that the Gaza Health Ministry data was too conservative, not that it was an overcount, but rather a gross undercount. This is what they said. By combining three data lists, official hospital lists, a Ministry of Health survey, and social media obituaries, we provide an estimate of mortality and accounts for underreporting. We estimate a total mortality from traumatic injury of 64,260 people, implying that the Ministry of Health reports underestimated deaths by 41%. And they say that as of October 2024, the official Ministry of Health estimate was 41,909, which would suggest that the true mortality figures probably exceeded 70,000 people, Norm. And so if you talk to Israel supporters and you confront them with this, they'll tell you that these numbers may be high, but overall Israel has been justified in what's done in Gaza, that this is simply war. And many will even concede that war crimes are being committed, but they're often dismissed as one-off incidents or bad apples and not routine, baked into the way that Israel operates toward the Palestinians and what its rules of engagement are in Gaza. You frequently note in interviews that there is no war in Gaza, that it's wrong to call it that. There's not really any fighting or battles. The first few weeks of the war, in fact, there were no ground operations at all. Israel was dropping 2,000-pound bombs on apartment buildings, UN buildings, schools, ultimately hospitals. And this has been consistent with how Israel has fought in the past, as you have documented. You lay out all the evidence in your book, Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. So, historically, how does Israel fight its so called wars in Gaza? How do Israeli soldiers behave when they conduct their ground operations in Gaza? And in what ways did Israel's previous incursions into Gaza and the support that they have received from its chief backer, the United States, created the precedent for what we're seeing today?
First of all, Israel was at one point, the Israeli army was at one point a fighting force. About that, I don't think there can be any dispute. They began during the World War II. There was, or in the 30s, during what was called the Arab Revolt between 1936 and 39. They started to get serious training from the British. There was a fellow, he seemed to have been a psychopath in the British Army named Ord Wingate. And he started training the Israelis. They then had, or I should say, what was called, but they weren't yet Israelis, the fighting forces in the Israeli Yishuv. That was the pre-Israel Jewish community in Palestine, YISHUV, the Yishuv. And they also had a lot of fighting experience during World War II. And by the time the 1948 war comes around, they are maybe not on the order of the Red Army, but they are a competent fighting force. And that was displayed. And also they had the morale. Let's be clear about that. Leon Trotsky, who was the leader of the Russian Red Army, he said in his military writings, and there is a book devoted to his military writings, he said morale is the principal factor in war, and not technique, but morale, the morale of the soldiers. And you have to bear in mind, and we shouldn't poo-poo it or dismiss it, This was right after the Nazi Holocaust. The Jews were determined to get a state by hook or by crook. They wouldn't allow anything to stand in their way, and they conducted themselves with complete and total ruthlessness and also effective fighting. By the time we get to the 1967 war, I'm skipping the war in 1956, the British, French, Israeli assault on Egypt, the Sinai invasion. If we go to 67, there's a bit of a misnomer about, in my opinion, a misapprehension about the level of competence of the Israeli army in 1967. I know it's widely depicted as the Six-Day War, in which the Jews, or the Israelis at this point, the Israelis uh, delivered a stunning military victory to the Arab states. It's not really true. Um, there was a decent historian named Patrick Seal, Seale, and he had a chapter in one of his books describing 1967. He called it the Six-Day Walkover. The Six-Day Walkover. Because believe it or not, I know this might sound like hyperbole, but I think I can confidently say it's not. The Six-Day War, as it's called, was actually over in 6 minutes. Now, I know that sounds like hyperbole, but I can assure you it's not, because the Israeli Air Force launched a preemptive attack on the Egyptian Air Force, which was all parked in on the ground. The planes were all on the ground. Once they wiped out the Egyptian Air Force, it became, and now I'm quoting Walt Rostow, who was the national security advisor to Lyndon Johnson, the president of the time. He described the war as, quote, this is the first day. He described the war as, quote, a turkey shoot, because the Egyptian army had no air support. They had no cover. The Air Force had been wiped out in about 6 minutes or 10 minutes. I can't remember. It was like 6 minutes or 10 minutes. The Egyptian Air Force was wiped out, and therefore the tanks, the troops had no air cover, air protection. So it was a turkey shoot. The Israeli planes went in, killed everything in sight. You know, it was very easy. On the Jordanian front, hardly any uh, weapons were fired. I know people will contest that. I can cite the sources. I'm not saying they're the definitive sources, but they're good sources. So after 1967, the next major war is 1982. 1982, there seemed to have been some resistance by the Palestinians in Lebanon, by the PLO, but there was on the PLO side, there was a very high level of incompetence because Arafat basically chose military leaders who were going to be um, flunkies, not on the basis of competence. And many of them fled the field of battle. And Israel, again with that lethal air force, it killed about, the estimates are 15 to 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinian civilians, overwhelmingly civilians, 15 to 20,000. The next major engagement comes in Lebanon again, but this time it's versus the army of God, the Hezbollah. And there you see they're beginning to display a much lower level of military competence, in part, I believe, because they were no longer highly motivated. This was not, you know, the fancy term, it's not any longer existential wars. Israel fought, you could say, an existential war in 1948. Now, it's true, as Benny Morris puts in one of his books, the stronger side won. Israel had more troops in 1948. It had more military equipment after the first 3 weeks. The first 3 weeks it was tough, but after the first 3 weeks it had more military equipment. But it was still a competent fighting force with a very high level of morale because it was, we're getting that state. We're getting that state by hook or by crook. We're getting that state. By 19, uh, uh, by the 1980s and up until 2000, there wasn't that same sense of existential threat. There wasn't that same high morale. And you see the competence beginning to diminish of the Israeli fighting force. And in 2000, the Hezbollah managed to expel Israel from southern Lebanon. 2006, well, the 34-day war, uh, I think it's correct to say Hezbollah won. The Israelis call it a stalemate. In any event, from there you start seeing a downward curve in which Israel is no longer fighting wars. If you look at Operation uh, Cast Lead in 2008-9, which you mentioned, Operation Protective Edge in 2014, this was not wars. Actually, to be honest, Israel didn't really describe them as wars. They described it as mowing the lawn. Mowing the lawn is not a, a warlike metaphor. Mowing the lawn uh, conjures the image of some suburban home where somebody goes out with a lawnmower and cuts the grass. These were not wars. The Goldstone Report described Operation Cast Lead as designed to humiliate, punish, and terrorize the civilian population. That's what they said its goal was. Humiliate, punish, and terrorize the civilian population. It's not a war, obviously. Uh, and so, beginning, I would say, in the so-called mowings of the lawn in Gaza, it ceased to be wars. There was a difference, however, between what happened before and after October 7th. Israel, before October 7th, it viewed its goal, its objective, as periodically you mow the lawn in Gaza. The grass grows in that sense. The people of Gaza become more self-confident and independent-minded. It's time to send in the Air Force and the artillery to mow the lawn. After October 7th, there was a clear decision. We're not mowing the lawn anymore. It's time to extirpate, which is the fancy word for pull out by the root. After October 7th, the decision was made, we're going to solve the Gaza question, the so-called final solution to the Gaza question. And so they were no longer mowing the lawn. They were going to extirpate every blade of grass in Gaza. As it happened, half of those blades were children. Uh, and that took basically three forms. There was outright genocide. Remember Amalek, the uh, and genocidal statements of that sort. There was the attempt at massive ethnic cleansing at the very beginning, but that didn't work because Egypt vetoed it. And then there was the probably what became the overarching motive, which was to make Gaza uninhabitable. And I think that goal has been achieved. There's nothing left in Gaza.
Well, I want to ask you about that because right now Israel is the current operation in northern Gaza has been recognized as an ethnic cleansing campaign by a number of sources, Oxfam, Human Rights Watch, but also most recently, Very notably, former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon. He said the same thing. You'll really barely read about what's really going on in this war, that there's not much fighting in the U.S. corporate media, but in the Israeli press, like Haaretz, they routinely document all of these atrocities in Gaza. Just the other day, they described a culture of revenge among many of the enlisted. And if you need any more evidence of this sort of routine behavior, you can look at the social media feeds of the Israeli soldiers deployed in Gaza who really enthusiastically post their own war crimes on their Instagrams and Facebook openly. Where does this come from within Israeli society? How do you explain all of this?
There are a couple of comments to make. First of all, there is something unusual about what's going on, at least as compared. Let's say if you take the case of the Nazi extermination, it had what you might call its ironic aspects. We can use that term in the context of the extermination of the Jews. The Nazis were supposed to carry out the final solution with complete coolness, objectivity, and detachment. And that meant you were not allowed to give free vent to your sadistic, as it were, animal impulses. That was contrary to the Nazi doctrine. The Nazi doctrine was most famously put in a speech by, I guess it was Himmler at Posen, or Poznan, Posen. It was the famous speech in which he said, poor us, meaning we Germans, poor us, that we have been um, chosen to carry out the final solution of the Jews, who are such a menace, pest, and cancer in human society. And so you were supposed to do it, carry it out with a certain amount of reticence and detachment. So, um, believe it or not, it's actually, as I said, it's ironic to the point of irony overreaching itself. There were many Nazis who were prosecuted for for sadistic behavior. They were prosecuted for sadistic behavior. Uh, in the case of the Israelis, there is a kind of what you might, yes, I think it's accurate since you're in Brazil. There was a carnivalesque atmosphere about the extermination they're carrying out in Gaza, and it's all posted on the web. There's an Israeli historian, Lee Mordechai, and he has a very large compilation documenting the Israeli genocide. And really, the most harrowing and heart writhing pages of his dossier is his cataloging of one video after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, just describing the videos, just describing the videos that are posted by the Israelis soldiers. Where does it come from? I think it comes from many sources. Uh, the pure racism, which it's true. I mean, I hate slogans like settler colonialism, which I think are pretty meaningless. But there is an aspect, of course, to settler colonies wiping out indigenous populations, and that you need a certain ideological justification for that kind of activity. And the usual ideological justification is that the indigenous population is somehow subhuman. So there is that aspect. There's this whole secularized version of chosenness in Israeli society, this notion that we're not just better than Arabs, believe me, not just better than all the Goyim, all the non-Jews. They have contempt. There used to be a governor of New York State named Nelson Rockefeller. And he was one of the Rockefeller brothers, which originally were the oil barons. And they used to say of Nelson Rockefeller, he's a true Democrat. He's a true Democrat. He's a true Democrat. He has contempt for everybody. And that's what basically the Israelis, they have contempt for everybody, but they preserve or reserve a special contempt for Arabs in general, and you could say Gazans in particular. And then compounding the settler colonialist aspect, the secularized chosenness aspect, combining it was they did want to exact a real revenge for October 7th. There's no question in my mind about that. They wanted to exact a, they were outraged, just like Nazis, by the way. The idea that these Untermenschen, these subhumans, could carry out this action. But the Israelis were not outraged just at the sheer killing on October 7th, which is a very high order of magnitude. They were outraged at the technical competence that Hamas had revealed, and also outraged at the technical incompetence that Israel's high-tech society had revealed. So when you combine all those factors, uh, as you point out, as you pointed out in your introductory remarks, if you go back and read um, the Israeli testimonies, the breaking the silence testimonies, there's nothing new under the sun. But I would say it's correct to say at some point, um, quantity turns into quality. It becomes something, when it's so massive, so intense, then it's qualitatively something new. And quantity did turn into quality after October 7th.
There was one revealing incident involving this that I can't really wrap my head around, and maybe you could explain it for me. It happened this summer, and obviously, we always hear, we're constantly hearing about the hostages that Hamas has in Gaza. But as B'Tselem reported this year in the report Welcome to Hell, Israel has had over 10,000 Palestinians, which it's abducted from Gaza and the West Bank, in detention. More than 5,182 of those people were detained before October 7th as hostages, if you want to call them that.
I
Um,
think you should call them that. They're not detainees, they're hostages.
okay. Well, these hostages were in these prisons like State TMN. There was a video that was released which showed the sexual abuse of Palestinian detainees. This has been something that's been reported on for a long time, but there was finally a video of this. And the reaction in Israel to this incident was protests. But these were not protests that were on behalf of the Palestinians who were being sexually abused. These were protests, Norm, that they had on behalf of the abusers, saying that they shouldn't be punished. And they basically barged into this facility and demanded that they release these soldiers who were being investigated for rape. So how do you explain that? In what type of, you know, moral framework? What does it take for somebody to view their own ethnic people as their lives as more valuable than any others to that
Well,
extent?
I think it's a combination of two things. It's uh, first of all, the nationalist fervor of this Jewish state, this lunatic nationalist fervor. And then it's combined with the fact that Israel has a citizen army. Now, under normal circumstances, I would say that's a good thing. I think just like everybody has to pay taxes, every citizen should have to bear the burden of the defense of their country. Uh, and nobody should be able to escape that burden, which can be in certain circumstances, it could be mortal to bear that burden. But I don't think, during the Vietnam War, We had I can't remember, it was, it's funny, it slipped my mind, but students got deferments. If you were in college, you got an automatic deferment for the period you were in college. And so, as you can imagine, it was poor people who had to do the fighting. So there is a merit to the notion of a citizen army, but there's also a downside. The downside is that you can't use the argument, it's just a few rotten apples who are carrying out this horror. It's representative of the entire Israeli society. It's a cross section of Israeli society that's carrying out the horror. And so for a lot of Israelis, it's there but for the grace of God go I. Namely, in that situation, I might be doing that because it's your brother, it's your sister, it's your son, it's your daughter, it's your cousin, it's your family. So they're very protective because this army, you might say, it doubles the usual normal nationalist fervor of any country in time of war. It's doubled by the fact that everybody sees themselves, but for the grace of God, in that army, because it's a citizen army, it's a cross section. So when they're cheering, they're demanding exoneration, it's a projection. They're demanding exoneration for themselves because they know they could be in that position. It's their family. During the war in Vietnam, say, we never thought of, if you were like myself, white, lower middle class, attending college, we never saw the soldiers as being ourselves. We did not. They were kind of a they were several degrees removed from us. We didn't grow up with them. We grew up in neighborhoods where everyone went to college. We weren't in their income bracket. We didn't, of course, we identify with them roughly as Americans. But beyond that, no. In the case of Israel, every soldier is a citizen. Every citizen is a soldier. There are some exceptions, but you get the picture. And so they see themselves in those soldiers. It's not like they say, "Oh, those are they're uncivilized or they're brutal." They'll never say that. They'll never say they're uncivilized, they're uneducated. That's what we would say. There was a famous case in the United States, the My Lai massacre, and the person who was the scapegoat was a guy named Calley, Lieutenant Calley. And when we looked at Cali, he was some hick, from the South. And we would say, oh, he's uneducated, uncultured, uncivilized. That's how we distance ourselves from the crimes of people like Cali. But they can't do that. They would never do that because it's their family. So it's not surprising. The last poll I read, I think I read it in Lee Mordecai's compilation, but I'm not sure. It was more than 60% of Israelis were against punishing soldiers for wrongdoing, including the rape charges.
So I think everybody at this point understands that one of the ways, and really the way that Israel is able to do what it does with impunity toward the Palestinians, its invasion of Gaza, but also its annexation of the West Bank and invasion of surrounding countries, bombing of Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon, is the United States' support for it, diplomatic and obviously arming and funding those conflicts to the tunes of many tens of billions of dollars. One of the reasons why this happens and how the system functions so fluidly is because if you object in the United States to this funding of Israel and our unconditional support for this foreign government, you're instantly accused of anti-Semitism and Jew-hating bigotry. And this is something that you've experienced and many others have experienced who try to criticize Israel. Really across every major American institution, especially after October 7th, we've seen this from academia to government to the workplace. Critics of Israel, including Jewish ones, are consistently met with charges of this type of bigotry. They're swiftly punished for their views. Billionaires like Bill Ackman organize blacklisting campaigns for college students who criticize Israel or reject Zionism. College professors like yourself, Steve Salacia, and Maura Finkelstein are denied tenure or flat out fired for their Israel views. Professional schools, corporations, and law firms consistently fire and blacklist students and young professionals who merely participate in protests or wear keffiyeh scarves. Entire online databases have been constructed, Norm, like Canary Mission and Stop Anti-Semitism, to render these critics of Israel as unhireable anti-Semites. There has really been a major assault on free speech in order to maintain this unquestioning and unconditional support that we have for Israel, one that you document in your latest book, I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, and other writings like The Holocaust Industry, where you show your consistency on free speech issues by bringing forth a critique not only of the suppression of pro-Palestinian speech, views that you agree with, but you also spend a lot of time critiquing the excesses of the woke left, who, well before October 7th, promoted the framework for much of the censorship that we've seen. Do, do you recognize that those tactics being deployed by the pro-Israel lobby against their critics to be kind of exactly the same, if not more extreme and effective than the so-called woke left, which I constantly hear these same Israel supporters denouncing when it comes to any other group of people?
Number one, this whole woke cancel culture has been a royal disaster for two basic reasons. Basic reason number one is our strongest weapon is the truth. The facts are on our side. And we should not fear any public confrontation on the basis of the facts. Now, when you start invoking the right to censorship because, quote, it makes me feel uncomfortable, or, quote, it makes me feel unwelcome, you are now providing the perfect pretense, excuse me, perfect pretext to silence unwanted speech. But that's exactly what we don't want to silence, because it's precisely because the facts are on our side. The truth is on our side. Justice is on our side. So we shouldn't allow for the creation of pretexts on the basis of feeling uncomfortable and unwelcome. We shouldn't allow for the creation of those pretexts to silence speech. It's completely insane what the woke cancel culture did. And I might add, I predicted it. If you turn to page 37 of my last book, I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, I explicitly said if pro Palestinian students protest a Israeli coming to campus on the grounds that it makes us feel unwelcome and uncomfortable, I said it's only a matter of time before the other side's going to say the same thing. That these slogans, these speakers, are making us, meaning Israelis and Jews, feel uncomfortable. It was a complete disaster. I will just give you one fact. I live in New York. I'm within, you could say, 20 miles of about 40 universities and colleges and community colleges within the within the circumference, about 40 miles. Uh, uh, excuse me, about 40 colleges and universities and community colleges. Do you know in New York, since September, I didn't receive one invitation to speak? I got my first one yesterday from Brooklyn College. That was the first one. Now everybody's terrified to invite a dissenting speaker on Gaza to their campus.
Let me ask
That
you about
was,
the,
I have no idea, I have no doubt that that attempt would have been made anyway to silence woke culture or no woke culture, cancel culture or no cancel culture. But you provided the pretext. You provided it on a silver platter. Now all they have to say is we feel unwelcome, we feel uncomfortable, and we feel unsafe. And that's it. It's over. Number two, there was one fundamental difference between the supporters of the Palestinians and the other side. You know what the fundamental difference is? Money. The Palestinian side, all they can rely on is moral fervor. But the other side, they then enabled the billionaire Jewish supremacist class to say, we are withholding our alumni contributions, which were very substantial, not necessarily as compared to the endowments of places like Harvard. Yes, relatively speaking, the donor alumni contributions were relative to their endowments were small, no question about that, but they were still very substantial sums of money. We're talking about $50 million here, $100 million there. That's one of the consequences of this massive unequal distribution of wealth in our society. The super rich now, for them, literally $50 million, $100 million, it's nothing. It's nothing. But for most of humanity, it's a significant sum of money. And now what did they do? We're withholding our donor alumni contributions because Jewish students feel unsafe, unwelcome. You gave the pretext. We don't have that kind of money. We just don't, our side. And so we didn't have the prerogative of going to the college presidents and the board of trustees with that sort of threat. I didn't realize that aspect, by the way. I understood you were opening a door to a disaster by using the veto of unwelcome, unsafe. Uncomfortable, unwelcome, unsafe. You were opening uh, uh, a disaster. And I knew these folks operate behind the scenes. When I was denied tenure at a completely negligible university, negligible university, I knew it was behind the scenes. The board of trustees were putting pressure on the university. It wasn't Alan Dershowitz. It was the board of people with money putting pressure on the university. I understood that. But now it's just brazen. It's out in the open. When William Ackman denied the money, said, I'm not, and he had given money a lot, like $50 million a year or something to Harvard. That was just the tip of the iceberg because then a letter was sent to Harvard by my memory is, but my memory is not perfect right now, over 1,000 Jewish alumni saying they weren't going to give money to Harvard. So it began to snowball, and then the money becomes significant. The money becomes significant. Um, Even though, as I said, with the two caveats, that for most people already Ackman's $50 million is significant, but also the caveat that Harvard's endowment was such that it didn't seem so large. Um, so it was a disaster. And it requires, part of being on the left, as people like Rosa Luxemburg pointed out a long time ago, is you have to be self-critical. You have to, what is politics? It's many things, but one of the things it is learning from history, learning mistakes, learning from errors. When a mistake, an error occurs, or a disaster occurs, to critically reflect. What did we do wrong? If anything, sometimes, disasters happen, we have no control over it. What did we do wrong? Also, of course, what did we do right? That's important. I think, for example, Bernie Sanders, I think he did a lot of things right. And I hope the left would learn from what we did right, but we should not allow our ego to cloud out the reflection on what we did wrong. And I believe that this whole woke cancel culture has been a complete catastrophe, which was completely and totally ignorant, ignorant, ignorant of our history. Do you know, if you look at the history of the battle for free speech in our country, because it was a very big battle, it's one thing to have it in the Constitution, but believe me, it took a lot to transform what was in the Constitution into actual law. A good 80% of the cases that say came before the Supreme Court, they were by people of the left. They were fighting for the right to advocate the right to overthrow a government, advocating the right to unionize. There was a huge body of uh, litigation that went eventually to the Supreme Court, and it was largely by the left. And then suddenly, this so called left, in my opinion, it's not left at all, but this so called left, this woke cancel culture, it abdicated and it jettisoned that whole history and substituted for it what can only be described as a complete disaster. But I want to also enter the caveat that I do believe, of course, there would have been an assault by Jewish, uh, the billionaire Jewish supremacist class. Yes, there would have been an assault, but it would not have been so easy for them. They just had to pronounce three words: uncomfortable, unwelcome, and unsafe. And that shut down all debate, shut down all debate across the country. That was a disaster. I hope people will, I hope some people, those who are invested in DEI, obviously that's their bread and butter, the Robin DiAngelos, the Ibram X. Kendis, that's their bread and butter. So they're not going to critically reflect. But everybody else, I think, should do some soul searching. Was that a wise strategy by the left? And on that, I'm going to have to get off because I have another appointment. Mr. Berger, uh, we can always, do it again in the future.
Well, Professor, thank you so much for joining me. It was really a privilege to speak with you. Um, Let me ask if people want to support your work. I know you have an upcoming book coming out later
I
this year.
don't, I don't look.
Oh,
I'm at the on the other side of midnight. Actually, I'm way past the other side of midnight, so I don't look for support. I have a roof over my head. I have food in my refrigerator, and fortunately, I have heat in the winter. No air conditioning in the summer, though. I ruled that out. Uh, so we should do is try to think about ways to support Gaza, and it's not
yeah.
so easy actually to come up with ways right now. And do our best, which is very tough, to prevent it from being removed from uh, the agenda of our society. Right now, it's gone. If you look at the front pages of the papers, Gaza is gone.
Yeah.
Has been already for about a month. Um, We have to do what we can.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Norm. It really means a lot. And we'll stay in touch and I hope to speak to you soon.